hello, good afternoon. I'm Shannon Sclafani, head of the Michigan District Council of the Urban Land Institute. On behalf of ULI, I would like to welcome you to this virtual presentation and express how much we all hope that you are well, safe, and doing well during this unprecedented time. I hope that this call will go smoothly, but also hope that you will forgive us any hiccups that may occur as we learn how to use this technology in a more expanded capacity than we have before. We will get there. We have already set the default for all of you to be muted for the majority of this meeting. And we ask that you also disable your video for the duration of the presentations in order to ensure that we have proper bandwidth. This meeting's presentation is being recorded and we will share the presentation on our website soon after. In just a few moments, I'll turn it over for our speakers to start, but want to share the format of this meeting to ensure that we can maximize everyone's time. Victoria will be monitoring the chat for questions that you may have throughout the presentations. We've reserved the last third of the meeting for a robust question and answer session with our speakers and with each other. So please allow Victoria to call on you to unmute and ask your question during that time. However, we know that you are all problem solvers, so please feel free to jump in on the chat and provide answers or resources that you are aware of. Our members are our greatest resource, and we know that you are working to help cities and communities navigate the pandemic and rebuild after it in ways that foster social equity and provide opportunity for all. As our ULI family, we want you to know that we are here for you. We are committed to doing all we can to support ULI members and their partners as they navigate this strange new world of ever-changing information and worry. Although we cannot come together in person, as is our practice, with online presentations like this one, we are coming together virtually. Now and in the coming weeks, ULI is rolling out online and web-based content of all kinds dedicated to informing and connecting ULI members. We need each other now more than ever, and now more than ever, we need policies, solutions, and strategies that lift up everyone and leave no one behind. With that, I'm going to pass it off to the co-chair of the ULI Michigan District Council, Jill Ferrari.
Good afternoon, everyone. Shannon, can you hear me?
I can.
My internet is down, so I apologize. I can't see the presentation or the slides, but I am here on audio on my phone. I just want to welcome everybody and let you know that ULI leadership, both at the Michigan level and the national level, are working very hard to try to find ways to serve the members and the community in this COVID crisis. We are really looking to ways to keep you connected and informed. And as Shannon mentioned, we're rolling out a series of webinars that stem from our town hall that was held recently, tackling the topics that we are hearing from you are the hardest right now, the things that you need to talk about. And that's why we're very excited to present this webinar on how to deal with tenants and rent collection in this very trying time. There are a significant amount of resources on our website at our COVID-19 resource page. There are links to national webinars held by ULI National, as well as our local events. There are a number of articles on the market during the crisis and projections moving forward. So please see our website and our COVID-19 resource page for more information and to get more connected. As I said, this particular webinar is dedicated to the topic of rent collection, dealing with tenants in these trying times, and we're very excited to have three seasoned professionals here talking to us today: Tom Litzler, Scott Sheffman, and Brian Holt. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and give you their backgrounds, but welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Jill. We're going to get right into it. First up, we've got Tom Litzler with Showstack Brothers and Company, who is going to give us a little bit of information about his background and what they're doing and seeing.
Thanks, Shannon. Happy to be here. As you said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Showstack Brothers and Company. Showstack is a 100-year-old family-owned real estate company. We have holdings in retail, office, light industrial, distribution, multifamily, and office build-to-suits. We operate a footprint in 25 states across the country. Prior to being with Showstack, I was the president of Brixmor West, and I was the president of Brixmor Midwest. I was also an executive with Ramco Gershenson Property Trust, and I was the head of development for Farmer Jack, a food store chain here in Detroit that some of you probably remember. And along the way, I've dabbled in development and brokerage myself. So to the question, what has Showstack been doing during this unprecedented time to promote tenant relations and still collect our rents? When we saw this storm brewing, we developed two tools. One we call a rent relief tracker, which was an inbound Excel-based tool to track any tenants that either contacted us with email, called us, wrote us letters, did any kind of self-promotion, made any kind of proposal to us, whether it was formal or informal. So we logged those requests. Whoever took them, logged them, whether it was a property manager, a leasing agent, myself, or what have you. In addition to that, we dug into our data as to when rent was traditionally collected during the course of a month. And we built what we call a rent tracker, where we track exactly who pays and on which date they paid. But before we had to use those tools, we had to recognize a few things. Was a lender on a property a bank, or was it a CMBS lender? If it's a CMBS lender, you really don't have a lot of latitude. You've got to work through a servicer, and things take a lot of time. So you've got to be able to explain that to tenants that hey, we've still got obligations. We're sympathetic to you. We're not going to default you. We're not going to charge you interest, but bear with us while we process your request and try to do something about it. On the other hand, the banks that we work with were fairly flexible to us and granted us, a little bit of relief so we could work with the tenants. In our retail portfolio, we're anywhere from 50 to 80% collected right now, and that's about 500 various different tenants. Our office portfolio is about 90% collected now, and our warehouses and what have you are pretty much fully paid. So our focus is obviously on retail and what to do about it, and that's really where the most communication with tenant comes in. So what did we do? First of all, we were proactive. We were sympathetic, but we were still insisting that we had obligations. We had to pay our debt service, we had to operate our centers, we had to pay our people, so we wanted to get paid. So back to the tools that we came up with. How do we use that data? We put our tenants in 3 different buckets. Bucket number 1 was the people that paid us. We don't have to do anything about that. Bucket number 2 was the people that had formally requested relief. And bucket number 3 was the people that either they didn't pay us, they didn't call us, we didn't know what was going on. So back to bucket number 2, everybody that was in bucket number 2 got assigned a leasing rep to go after them, to go talk to them. And their tactic or their mandate was to, answer the tenant's request, but try to negotiate a deal in consideration for giving some type of relief. So if a tenant came to us and said, hey, we can't pay April and May rent, but we'll pay you back, next year. Our basic approach was that wasn't good enough. We looked for more. We looked to see if there was something else in the lease from those tenants that we could get, easing of restrictions, or were they at a point in their lease where we could get them more term, maybe trade off 2 or 3 months and get them to exercise an option, get them to extend for a year, something like that. So, we've undertaken a massive endeavor in that respect. We've got about 135 tenants in our shadow anchored Walmart portfolio that we're talking to in that bucket. And we've made deals with about 1/3 of them already that generally, or that exclusively represent upside to us. We got more term than we gave up. The 3rd bucket, the people that didn't talk to us, that didn't pay us, we turned our collections department and our property managers onto them. And they basically came across with a, very sympathetic business approach. Hey, we haven't heard from you. What's going on? And, we got a myriad of responses. Some of the responses were, hey, we applied for a PPP loan. As soon as we get it, we'll pay you. Hey, we're glad we called you. Can we work something out? So in those instances, those opportunities were turned over to the leasing staff to cut those kinds of deals with. So in general, we looked for ways to increase lease term or relax clauses in leases, so that we could, get a win-win for ourselves as well as for the tenants. We didn't put a lot of emphasis on whether or not the tenant was applying for PPP. We didn't insist on them proving that to us. We recommended that they did it, but with the volume of tenants that we had and the rate at which we wanted to get through these, we assumed if they got it, they have to pay us, otherwise they're going to lose the money. So we just operated in good faith, and so far I'm pleased to say that we're getting really good results, and that's really the conclusion of my introductory remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. It's sounds like a really good lesson in knowing to communicate with your landlord, as you guys definitely gave a little bit of more leniency towards those who actually came and communicated to you. Up next, we have Scott Sheffman, who is the Executive Managing Director at Friedman Real Estate Group. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Shannon. Nice to be with you today. As Shannon said, my name is Scott Sheffman. I'm an Executive Managing Director with Friedman Real Estate. We are a fully integrated real estate service provider, brokerage management, construction services, that also happens to own commercial real estate for its own behalf, on its own behalf. Our commercial management portfolio is currently about 16 million square feet, split down the middle, about half owned, half third party managed. In contrast to Tom's portfolio at Showstack, which I think has a much heavier retail bent to it, our management portfolio is concentrated more in the office flex and industrial arenas. For April, collections, at least on the owned side of our portfolio, averaged around 97%. Not everybody paid on time, but with some phone calls and some gentle nudging, we were able to get to that 97% mark. Part of the reason I think that we were able to achieve 97% collection in April was that the stay-at-home order didn't go in effect until the end of March, I think March 24th, if I remember correctly. Also, I think most businesses had on hand at least a month or two of operating reserves that they could dip into had their revenues not been sufficient to pay rent for the month of April. May, however, will certainly be more challenging based on the number of calls that we've already received to date requesting relief. So what are we doing with the relief calls that we're getting for May rent? Couple of prerequisites in order to have the relief conversation with us. First, the tenant has to be in good standing. They have to be current on rent, and that includes the payment of April rent. Non-starter if they are not in good standing. Second, we're asking most tenants to sign a pre-negotiation agreement with us. It's your typical P&A. Basically says that the discussions that we're having aren't final until they're put into writing, that we as landlord aren't waiving any of our remedies by having these discussions, and that you tenants are going to keep these discussions between us confidential. Once the P&A is signed, then we have been asking our tenants to demonstrate hardship to us. We understand a lot of our tenants are in fact experiencing hardship, but we want to know how and where they're feeling that. So we've generally asked them to fill out a questionnaire, gives us some basic information on what they've experienced over the past month and how it's impacted them from a financial standpoint. We've generally asked for some financials as well. Once we've received the financials, we've then asked the tenants to demonstrate to us that they've at least pursued one of these public stimulus programs. They've pursued monies through one of these public stimulus programs, the most well-known being the PPP, the Paycheck Payment Program, if they were eligible. So let's say that the tenant complied with all the prereqs, they signed the P&A, they demonstrated need, then what? To use a popular phrase from the recent past, we're looking for a bit of a quid pro quo. if we're going to give you tenant a benefit, we're looking for something in return, a benefit in return as landlord. Generally, what we are giving is rent deferrals. We have given a few abatements, but it's been many more deferrals than abatements. The amount of deferral or abatement is generally dependent on the specific level of need. So it's a tenant by tenant assessment. In return for these deferrals or abatements, we are getting, as Tom said, that Showstack is getting in many cases extra term on the back end of a lease. When we are deferring rent, we're trying to set hard repayment dates for the deferred rent with specific penalties for non-repayment of that deferred rent. And then we're asking for other concessions as well on a case-by-case basis, whether it be a waiver of a right to a security deposit, a waiver of a termination option or a co-tenancy provision, some agreements to provide ongoing financials so that we can monitor the health of the tenant going forward, and then generally an agreement to repay any deferred rent if stimulus monies are received. There's a couple of common tenant misconceptions, misnomers that we've been hearing along the way. And one of those being the suggestion by our tenants that, hey, we're partners and you can help me out because I'm your partner. And I think our response to that is, yes, well, we're partners in a figurative sense, and our fates are certainly intertwined in many ways, and we're certainly sympathetic to what is going on in your world. We're really not partners in a legal sense, and I think, in fact, the leases stipulate specifically that we're not partners or joint venturers. We haven't shared profits in the past. I don't think you, tenant, want to share profits with us going forward. So while we are sympathetic to your plight and we are trying to help you, we are not, in fact, legal partners. We've heard from other tenants that, hey, landlord, we know that your lenders are helping you out, so you should be willing to help us as well. Can tell you, not really true. None of our lenders are knocking down our door asking us how they can help us. And if we were to go to our lenders seeking relief, I think our lenders would be asking us for the same types of things that we're asking of our tenants, that being a demonstration of hardship and then some type of quid pro quo. Our lenders aren't going to abate debt service for us or delay debt service for us or modify debt service for us without something in return. So just wanted to dispel that misconception that I think certain tenants have. The final point, and I think Brian may speak to this a little bit, is the concept of force majeure. We've received a number of emails from tenants saying, hey, COVID-19 is a force majeure event and it excuses my obligation to pay rent. And our response has generally been, no, most of our leases don't delineate COVID-19. They delineate specific events that qualify as force majeure events, and they generally don't delineate disease, pandemic, or virus as a qualifying event. But even if they did, the concept of force majeure doesn't excuse the obligation to pay rent. It really only excuses the action that's been rendered impossible by the event. So simple answer is no, tenant. Unfortunately, force majeure is not an excuse for your obligation to pay rent to us. So that does it for my introductory comments.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Sure thing.
Needed a second to unmute. Okay, so up next, Victoria, we've got Brian Holt, who is a principal leader at Miller Canfield. He's one of their real estate attorneys. Welcome, Brian, and thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure, Shannon. Thanks for having us. So yeah, my name is Brian Holt. I am a real estate attorney with Miller Canfield. Miller Canfield, we're a full service global law firm in the AmLaw 200. Over 200 attorneys with offices across the U.S., Mexico, Canada, and as well as offices in China, Qatar, and Poland. So we cover the globe and help clients on all sorts of, all their legal issues in businesses around the world. So I myself have been with the firm for 20 years. I'm the leader of the real estate group, and we have over 40 attorneys that represent all aspects of clients in connection with commercial real estate, from landlords, tenants, developers, contractors, lenders, special servicers, governmental entities, school districts, the whole gambit. And we do help folks with leasing, acquisition, disposition, construction contracts, financing, workouts, foreclosures, the whole, if it relates in the real estate group, if it relates to dirt or financing related to dirt, we cover the whole thing. So that being said, when we as a firm saw the COVID-19 stuff start to pop up, in February and then into March, we realized that this was going to be a novel situation, that nobody really had any idea what was going on, and the myriad of kind of new and unique legal issues were going to be springing up, daily at a speed that most people hadn't seen before. So we as a firm put together a coronavirus response team in March to help clients meet their immediate and long-term challenges posed by the pandemic. So within days of that, we launched our COVID-19 Resource Center, which includes links to articles and alerts that we put together, giving folks guidance on how businesses and nonprofits can apply for these the PPP loans or other financing and funding provided by the CARES Act, as well as analysis of the CARES Act and all the other executive orders and everything that's come out over time. So as of today, we have put out over 60 articles and alerts since the crisis began, covering all aspects of what clients may need and questions that are coming up. So we've been working hard at that. We've transferred, obviously, like everybody else, transferred to practicing law from home, and that's worked pretty seamlessly. And we've been able to continue to provide services to people. On the real estate side, we are seeing, lots of questions. How does this affect my loan? How does this affect me as a tenant, as a landlord? What are all the different issues? And, as lawyers always say, the answer is it depends. And everything is very fact specific. And I know we're going to get into some specific questions and answers, so I won't get too much into the weeds because we'll have some specific questions on that. But certainly, as Scott mentioned, questions around force majeure and what does this mean for tenants? Do they have to pay their rent? Borrowers, do they have to pay their mortgages? And again, it depends. And I suppose that's what we'll be chatting about today. So that's Shannon. I'll turn it back over to Victoria, whoever's doing the questions now.
Thanks so much, Brian. So we wanted to just kick off some of the Q&A portions and get started and let you guys kind of riff off of each other. But and maybe this one is more specific to Scott and Tom, but what are some of the effective ways that you are collecting rent? Scott, you've been really successful thus far. Do you see that changing in the next month? As you said, it had sort of kicked off at the beginning. So just wondering what have you found effective thus far?
Yeah, as I said, I think we will be going into the month of May. We will be posed with more requests for relief than we were hit with in April, and we are sympathetic to the requests. We evaluate the requests, and we are looking for ways to be able to accommodate those requests. It's provided that a tenant can demonstrate some hardship, and that they have and demonstrate that they've exhausted some of the remedies that are out there to alleviate that hardship, that being some of the government's or other stimulus programs, and we can talk about a few of those, then we're willing to have that conversation. And we are, but it is a two-way street, and we're not looking to, as a landlord, to abate or defer without something in return. And to date, we've been successful in having that conversation. I think our tenants are receptive to it, and we've been able to work with one another, and I assume that we will be able to do the same going forward.
Tom, do you have anything additional you'd like to add to that?
I would say just pretty much reinforce everything that Scott said to communicate. The flexibility really comes at the front end, though, where you have it, because, you know, we did get some flexibility from some of the lenders, but that doesn't go on forever. That's short term. So it's easier for us to defer or abate rent right now in consideration for something later. We can't, make a deal for a year or something like that. It's a very short term, defined period of time, in consideration for something else.
Can we talk a second about the sort of different sectors or tenants and how you might treat them differently? You touched, Tom, very briefly about the difference between sort of CMBS versus bank lenders, private equity, publicly traded entities.
Well, back to my original point, with the CMBS lender, you really don't have flexibility until you work something out with the servicer and the special servicer. So to date, everything we've done has been with the bank portfolio, the parts of the portfolio that are financed by banks. But then within that portfolio, you're right, we've got over 40 Dollar Trees in our portfolio. Dollar Tree hasn't asked, but there's no way we give them any consideration. There's no way you give Kroger or CVS or anybody like that anything, because they're printing money right now. It's got to be somebody that's probably closed for business and probably has a difficult time getting back in business because of social distancing or what have you. So it's really case by case. And, in some instances, the mom and pop, the non-credit tenants are easier to deal with. But I would have to say, the credit tenants as well, or the national and regional tenants that we dealt with are really ready for this. And they've been, extraordinary, adept, and nimble in being able to make quick decisions, much quicker than, when you go get a new deal approved.
Yeah, and I would just add to that most of the stimulus programs have been geared at smaller businesses. So we've been encouraging our smaller tenants to apply for and see if they can qualify for those monies. Initially, the state had come out with a program. They had allocated about $20 million for small businesses, a combination of grants and low interest loans. That was being administered through the county economic development offices. That money dried up very quickly. When that dried up, we encouraged our smaller tenants, and by small tenant, I mean under the SBA definition, it's 500 employees or fewer, to pursue the PPP monies. As everybody knows, those monies ran out a few weeks in. I think the initial allotment was about $350 million. The federal government just signed new legislation to refund that program, or to additionally fund that program with about, I think it was another $310 million. So we are encouraging every small business in our portfolio to make application through that program. The SBA has another program called the Disaster Loan Program. Those are longer term loans up to, I think, a maximum of $2 million. Those, unlike the PPP, don't have as large of a forgiveness component to them under the PPP. If you follow certain rules, the most significant being that you utilize 75% of the funds received on payroll, you can seek to have your loan monies forgiven for, I think it's the first 8 weeks after you have received the monies that you spend on payroll and the 25% that you allocate towards other categories can be forgiven. Unlike the disaster loan program that only has a small forgiveness component to it. In addition, there are a couple of other programs out there. I know that Facebook has a small a grant program for small businesses in the areas in which they operate. Detroit happens to be an eligible area, and qualifying businesses can receive up to $4,000 of allocations from Facebook, combination of cash payments and ad credits. And the city of Detroit recently announced that it's partnering with Goldman Sachs to make available another 15 million of forgivable loans for small businesses as well. So a lot of resources out there, and the small businesses in our portfolio, we're encouraging to make application and try to make use of these funds, which in many cases are forgivable, thus free money.
Great. Brian, moving on to sort of the discussion on the PPPs and other sort of forgivable loan programs or low interest loan programs, and maybe for all three of you, how much are you taking sort of steps to provide sort of coaching on those? How much are people coming to you, Brian, for assistance in trying to fill out those applications? Are you just pointing them to other resources?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we have, like I mentioned about our COVID-19 Resource Center, we have a lot of resources on there that describe the programs, how they work, how the loan forgiveness works, Q&As up there about that. Generally, because this type of program is intended to be very simple, very quick. You can fill out limited amount of paperwork. Lawyers are helping people, point people in the right direction, but we're not drafting a lot of these documents and actually doing the loans in the way that we would on kind of normal loan transactions. So we're helping point our clients to resources and explain things. I think it is important, and some things that it was touched on here. The PPP loans, I think they are really designed for covering payroll. And so, and the amount of money that you can get is based on the size of your payroll, which may or may not have a real relationship to your real estate costs, right? You could certainly have, you could have a business that has a large staff and a relatively small space, and you could have get a fair size loan, and that 25% that you don't have to use towards payroll, then in that situation you could have enough money to help pay rent and other things like that. Whereas if you have a small staff but a large space, like certain businesses do, there's going to be a deficit there. And so that's one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily understand going into it. They think that the loans they're going to get the loans and cover all their expenses, and that's not what the program's designed for. And you still end up having to have pretty frank discussions with your landlords, even if you do get some PPP loan or other.
It's great. Are Tom and Scott, are you guys doing anything special to coach tenants along?
Well, we advised our tenants early on. We sent them the links to all these and pointed them in those directions and tried to get them to apply. But we didn't want to get too involved. We didn't want to act as coaches or counselors or take any kind of liability for coaching someone into the wrong program. So we took kind of a loose qualitative approach.
Sure.
Yeah, and I would say that we took a similar approach as Tom did. Directed tenants to the various websites and that detailed the programs, encouraged them to read up on those programs and determine whether they qualified, and if they did, to make application. And we've gently reminded them to check these programs out on a couple of occasions as well.
Great. So Scott, you touched, and I think Brian touched a little bit on the force majeure and the fact that there's really nothing in leases currently that covers pandemics or viruses. Do you think that the language of leases is going to change moving forward? Do you think that that will impact the way that future leases get written up?
Who are you asking?
Well,
I'm
let's.
going to defer to the lawyer on this one, so.
Well, so I think that, well, we've thrown around the word force majeure, and I think probably we have to talk about exactly what that is a little bit. So the idea of force majeure is if there is some sort of event that happens that's outside the control of either of the parties that prevents one of the parties from performing in some way. Usually that's going to be a fire or a flood or an earthquake or hurricane or
Uh-oh. Brian? I think we might have lost Brian. Okay. Anybody want to add to that, or should we just move on and try and get Brian back?
Yeah, I think if we get him back, he can let him finish his train of thought there.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we will we'll work on getting Brian back. I'm sure.
all right, I'm here.
Oh, you're here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
I just kept talking.
we lost you about half
Yeah.
your description of what force majeure covers.
Right. So, like I was saying, it's usually an event that happens to the parties, typically physical in nature, but could be something like a strike or something where the government shuts certain. But it's usually short-term in nature.
And I think Brian's having some internet difficulties. So
Yeah, Victoria, why don't you give him the phone number and see if he can dial in?
Leases don't excuse.
maybe in the meantime, we talk a little bit about repopulation and
Yeah.
how we plan on.
Victoria, can you give Brian a quick call and just ask him to dial in using the phone number? Thank you. Yeah, so what we were talking about next would be, how are you handling sort of holdover, move-ins, construction? How have you continued to do anything during this time? What have you been able to accomplish? You know, have you had to just sort of hold off on everything?
Tom, you want to?
Sure. You know, we have several spaces under construction with Beaumont up in Royal Oak. To your point, the city shut down. There's no way you can get inspections. You can't get plans reviewed. You can't get permits. You can't get certificates of occupancies. In addition to that, construction in the state of Michigan is shut down. So we're going to end up extending those rent commencement dates by, you know, what we hope is an equitable period of time. In a couple other instances, we're going to end up having to do the same thing, just give people additional time. We had an unfortunate situation where a tenant opened for business the very day this shutdown was put into place. So we're going to end up having to give tenants more time.
Yeah, like Tom, we've had a couple of construction jobs that were shut down, and we will likely have to extend some deadlines on those as well. In terms of holdovers and move-ins, we have had a few holdovers, but we were working with those tenants to reach amicable resolutions. Didn't have any move-ins occurring during this last 5-week period. I imagine, though, when the restrictions are lifted here, whether that's on the 15th of the month or sometime thereafter, we will start back up on our move-ins and our construction build out of our suites for new occupancy.
Yeah, it's a little easier to envision all of this now that I think we've all wrapped our head around May 15th as like this magical date. So can either of you speak to, I think specifically the repopulation plan? I'm interested to hear about sort of the shopping centers, but I think people are really interested to hear about the office environments and what the plan is sort of to get people back into those buildings, back into those environments, what falls on the landlord, what falls on the tenant, and to hear what your current line of thinking is.
Sure. First of all, what I'm hearing from a lot of our tenants is that they're sort of itching to get back to the office. While they've been able to adapt temporarily through remote work, they feel like they were more productive on many fronts in the office. Some of them are feeling a bit isolated at home. They miss the face-to-face interaction with their fellow employees that builds unity, camaraderie, et cetera. And a lot of them are saying that more of the creative folks are having trouble getting that innovation, that creativity, the idea generation that's much easier, that's born through a face-to-face conversation. It's much more difficult over the internet. So a lot of our tenancy is itching to get back into the building. And I think our challenge is to demonstrate to them that they can do so safely. If they think that they can get into their building safely, they will come back in large numbers. So what are we doing? First of all, we created an operational emergency team to prepare our buildings for reoccupation. And this team has been meeting almost every day for the last 2 weeks, putting together reoccupation plans. A few of the things that they're doing are as follows. Heavy cleaning, going to be cleaning and sanitizing our buildings from top to bottom in preparation for the return of tenants to those buildings. Putting into place new protocols for high touch areas, cleaning of those high touch areas in our buildings. Testing out a number of new cleaning techniques. I know one of them is this Clorox 360 electrostatic sprayer that has proven to be really effective and not too intrusive. Stocking our buildings with PPE, whether it be gloves, masks, hand sanitizers. Making sure that the mechanicals in our buildings are clean and that they are flushed before they're restarted. Making sure that we have circulation of fresh air in our buildings and that we're replacing air filters. Doing a number of things to force social distancing. We're creating traffic patterns in many of the common areas of our buildings so we can force people in certain directions so they won't cross paths inadvertently. We are removing seating from a number of our cafeterias and lobbies. In the restrooms, we're closing off certain stalls and sinks. We're limiting capacities in elevators. A lot of that type of stuff to force social distancing. A lot of signage that we're putting up in our buildings to encourage social distancing and to encourage proper office etiquette and hygiene. Also going to be limiting the entry points to our buildings, putting into place some new visitor policies, creating some dedicated shipping and receiving areas, limiting vendor access to our buildings, and then really creating a comprehensive outbreak response plan. If there is the unfortunate occurrence of in the unfortunate occurrence of an outbreak in a building, we're going to have plans that we will articulate to our tenants, plans of how to deal with that we will clearly articulate to our tenants.
Great. Tom, have you?
I think Scott's answer is very complete. The only thing that I would add to that is that we are going to increase the frequency of our janitorial services throughout the day to clean all those high touch surfaces and restrooms and elevators and door handles and whatnot. So other than that, nothing other than that.
The other thing that I was going to add is that while we can control what we do with our buildings and what we do with our maintenance folks and our other site people that work for Friedman, we have less control over what our tenants will do. So we are attempting to engage them now and to have conversations to make sure that they are encouraging their employee bases to act safely and to socially distance, to potentially stage or phase their repopulation of the building, to consider having certain portions of their workforce come in on odd days of the week, other portions come in on even days of the week, to not seat them next to one another in cubicles, to stagger office occupancies, a bunch of things along those lines. We are, for Friedman folks that enter Friedman buildings, we will have them answer questionnaires as we are doing currently to make sure that they are not at risk. And we are only letting them in the building if they answer these questionnaires in a certain manner that suggests they are not at risk. We are going to encourage our tenants to do the same with their employee bases, but it will be a little more difficult for us as landlord to control that.
So you're essentially, you can't force your tenants to sort of phase workers back in. So your hope is that they will, filter in at different times and things like that, but you don't have a ton of control over that necessarily.
I think that's probably fair to say. Yes, we can influence, but we cannot necessarily dictate. So that's why we're trying to have active conversations with a number of them. We're going to be holding some online workshops and doing Q&As with a number of our tenants to make sure that they have thought this out as well, and that we're all doing what we need to do to make sure that everybody is as safe as possible during this re-entry into our buildings.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from Brian when he rejoins us.
I'm here.
Oh, great. Brian, welcome back.
Hey, sorry about that. Great timing.
I'd love to hear, so Scott was just telling us, that Friedman has a great plan of repopulating the buildings, but really they can only give guidance to tenants on, the best way to sort of phase everybody back in and try and stagger their work days and provide, different working environments that allow people to social distance better and things like that. From a legal perspective, is that what would be considered enough from, sort of the landlord property management side to cover their bases in the event that another outbreak were to happen?
Great question. It's unclear. I think that the tenants are responsible to comply with the law, and they're responsible to provide for the health and safety of their employees and any visitors or customers that are coming to their spaces. So the landlord only has so much that it can do within the tenant spaces. Now the landlord has control over common areas and maybe access to the overall building if it's if it's got controlled entrances. But once you get inside the suites or the individual tenant spaces, it's up to the tenants, and there's really only so much that a landlord can do there. They can add, like they're saying, add guidance and try to make sure that the tenants are complying with the terms of the relevant executive orders and laws and regulations. But ultimately, it's up to the tenants to do that for themselves, because they're the ones that are going to be responsible if they don't. So the landlords just need to, kind of follow the rules the best they can and take every precaution they can. And, but that's not to say that if something happens, people aren't going to make claims. I mean, this is at the end of the day, this is going to result in all sorts of claims, and Scott and Tom are doing their best to keep their tenants safe and limit exposure. So that's all we can do at this point.
Perfect. Do you want to, did you want to give us just a finished giving a little bit of?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just jump back. So the current, I think the way force majeure is currently put forth in most commercial leases doesn't really, they don't contemplate pandemics, and they certainly don't usually, a lot of times they specifically exclude the payment of rent from being something that is excused by force majeure. Now, I do think that going forward, that's going to be re-examined because I said force majeure typically talks about floods, fires, storms, things like that. It really didn't contemplate wholesale shutdown of the economy nationwide. So I think, you know, in those shutdowns with the restrictions that prevented people from utilizing large swaths of the commercial real estate market. So I think there's probably going to be a wide-ranging discussions that go forward as to which parties should be in the best position to bear the risk of future situations like this, where there are shutdowns and interruptions due to government orders and national emergencies. I think that's going to be impacted as both Scott and Tom have talked about. Lenders are going to dictate a lot of this as to what sorts of, things are become excusable and reasons for, adjustments to payment terms going forward. And a lot of that then flows downhill to tenants. So, and then it's going to, a lot of the leases are probably going to have to do changes that come down are going to be about the leverage of the parties and the types of assets being discussed. I think retail is going to be treated differently than office or manufacturing, and hospitality is going to be treated even differently. So I don't have an answer. It's going to be very interesting to see where it goes, but I think there's going to be a large push to get these concepts, build them in some way into what is currently force majeure, but exactly what's going to end up being the quote unquote standard is it's way too early to say. There's going to be a lot of people flexing muscles, and we'll see where it goes.
Thanks so much, Brian. It was worth the wait to get the answer. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I don't think I need Victoria to call them out because there's only a couple in there right now. But we'll move over into the sort of audience Q&A. If people have additional questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. Gina Cavalier, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. If you're still on. Okay, well, I will read the question. So the question is, Gina left. Okay. Are you finding that tenants are aware of the local, state, and federal programs that are available to them and understand the requirements? So as you're sharing these programs, are you finding that the tenants understand whether they qualify, or are you just sort of sharing and sort of letting them figure it out?
I'll take a crack. We're finding that remarkably, most of the tenants do understand the programs. They do understand whether they can qualify, and often in instances where they can't qualify, they try to use that to their advantage to, negotiate even more from us. So I'm pleasantly surprised for, whether the tenant's a mom and pop or a semi-sophisticated regional chain, we haven't had an issue having to, overly educate them.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's been so much talked about in the news and in the print media regarding these programs that a large share of our tenant population is and was aware of these programs, and many more than I would have expected have either made application or are in the process of making application for these funds.
Okay, great. Rachel Ferris, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Shannon. Scott, my question was kind of more directed at you when you were talking about your, action plans to open the buildings back up, get tenants back in, and then how you will move forward to, ensure that tenants are going to stay safe. My question is, and I don't know if you guys have this plan in order yet, but if you were to open back up and have your tenants back in and you were made aware of a COVID outbreak, with one of your tenants or a couple of your tenants, how do you handle that? Do you just have to inform tenants and let them make their own decision, or do you shut back down, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rachel. We've had to deal with this situation already on a couple of occasions, and in each instance, we have followed the CDC guidelines. We have contacted the local county health department and taken direction from local health officials. And we've also engaged the services of an industrial hygienist to advise us on how to best move forward. In the two situations that I'm thinking of right now, in neither instance was it recommended that we shut the building down. Both buildings did receive a heavy cleaning, and tenants that were in tenants or others who we could determine were in direct proximity to the areas that might be affected were in fact notified. And I imagine going forward, we will deal with these types of situations in much of a similar fashion, that we will reach out to local county health officials, that we will continue to follow CDC guidelines, and that we will bring in and take direction from industrial hygienists who are skilled and practiced in this arena.
Thanks, Scott.
Sure.
Anything to add, Tom or Brian?
I don't.
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, I am very curious. Do you guys think, this is just off the top of my head, but do you think that the health departments are going to make any requirements for people to notify, who all will they have to notify if they test positive?
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. What you keep hearing from a lot of government officials regarding the reopening of the various state economies is that they want to have the 3 T's covered before they open: testing, tracking or tracing, and treatment. I think it remains to be seen how that middle T, testing and tracking, plays itself out, and what we will be required to report. I do think there will be a heavy focus on tracing going forward. I know in other countries where they've mitigated the spread of the disease, testing and tracing have been large components of their mitigation programs.
And to complicate that, though, we'll have to honor HIPAA and tenant privacy regulations. So that just throws another monkey wrench in it.
Yeah, the tracing is going to be the key part, and it's going to be very interesting how they actually end up implementing that, certainly with issues of HIPAA and privacy involved.
All right, wonderful. Well, we've got just 1 minute left. Do you have any final thoughts?
I would just reiterate that I think from my conversations with a lot of folks, whether they be tenants that are industrial, office, retail in nature, I think a lot of people, a lot of tenants are looking forward to the day when they can get back into their spaces and start conducting business as they had prior to. But they want to feel comfortable in knowing that they are safe going about their business. And I think as landlords, it's incumbent upon us to do what we can to make them feel safe and comfortable. And if we do so, if we're successful in doing so, I think they will come back in large numbers.
To add to that, I think it's going to take a while. I think what was normal 6 months ago is going to be a lot different 6 months from now. And we're going to have a lot of obstacles and regulations to contend with, and new normal.
I think that one of the issues that it's been touched on, but I think everybody needs to understand is whether you're a landlord or a tenant, every situation is different, and there aren't just going to be, rules or regulations issued by the government that answer all the questions. Landlord-tenant issues are governed by the leases. So whether you're a landlord or a tenant, the number one thing you should do is pull your lease out and read it, because that's really going to dictate the relationship you have with your landlord or your tenant, and what your rights are and what to do. So, just general advice: read your leases and pick up the phone and call the other party, because as Tom and Scott have made clear here, open communication is going to be the key to get through this. Just sort of clamming up and not paying rent if you're a tenant is not going to get you consideration down the road, right? So pick up a phone, be open, have a conversation, and that's going to be the best advice, or find a way forward here.
Well said.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. I hope that everybody online found it helpful, and that we have a better understanding of things moving forward, and hopefully that'll be in just a couple of weeks. We will be hosting these sort of online presentations every 3 weeks or so, with just some virtual happy hours and things like that in between. In 3 weeks, we plan on hosting one with the topic of municipal processes and how those are changing through the COVID crisis. So please join us in 3 weeks. And again, Tom, Brian, Scott, thanks so much for your time and all of your valuable information, and good luck.